We hear a lot about freedom today, personal liberties. Jesus has a few things to say about freedom, as does his friend the Apostle Paul. So, welcome to the next in our series of online messages. This is Reverend Tom Bentley, the pastor of the Raleigh Congregational Church, and we welcome you to an opportunity to reflect on your own spiritual path. Peace and best wishes. Recently, I was watching the news with this ongoing expansion of protests on different levels. And there's a group of people now who are protesting wearing masks, seeing this as a violation of their constitutional freedoms. Large posters with freedom, the word freedom are on it, and the folks are screaming at whomever, and one is holding a sign, selfish and proud of it. Selfish and proud of it. I think of my own generation, and we certainly had moments of selfishness, very much to be compared to often the unselfish commitments of the greatest generation of certainly of the 20th century, the folks who fought World War II and defeated fascism. I was ashamed of my own generation after a while, after the self-indulgent activities of the late 1960s. It took a while to repair the breach and find, through the commitment of social service and community concerns and activism, a way of maybe making up for, in a kind of penance almost, how self-centered our adolescence had been. It seems we're in another cycle like this, yet these are not naive college students. These are adults. We've seen a shift in the social ethic and what freedom means. We have the same word, but what does this freedom mean? What does the word freedom mean? The contemporary understanding of freedom misleads us into believing that, okay, if you're lucky and you're strong enough to be bold and beautiful and powerful enough, you can live without any obligations. There's no commitments. Life's going to be easy for you. There's no requirements whatsoever. I'm free. And unfortunately, some of our friends within the Christian tent have been preaching this prosperity ministry, which is the idea that somehow if you follow Jesus, you have a new freedom to get really rich and really absent of any obligations. Just have a good and happy life. When we encounter God's guidance through the Apostle Paul and the words of Jesus, we discover that they speak of a servitude, a slavery, a bondage, if you will, that comes through the event of faith. This is linked up to a new freedom, a new possibility of being somebody. We have forgotten in history that 2 millennia ago, back at the time of Jesus, the sense of the individual was different. Yes, there were individuals, but they were always part of a group, and individuality was seen and screened through that group identity. So when people spoke to groups or spoke as a self, they were really speaking for a community. We need to understand that when someone is guided in Scripture and the teachings of Paul through that way of seeing the world, there wasn't room for a lot of hyper individuality. There wasn't the wealth, the opulence. There wasn't the language for it. We in this republic, we who cherish individual rights so highly, have charted out the document of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which we often perceive as individual rights of freedom. With that comes, however, a deep obligation to the collective, to the community. We need to visit as often as we can this message. So today, for instance, we have in first the writing in Romans. Remember, you've been raised from the dead into God's way of doing things. Sin can't tell you how to live. After all, you're not living under that old tyranny any longer. You're living in the freedom of God. So, since we're out from under the old tyranny, does that mean we can live our old way any way we want? Since we're free in the freedom of God, can we do anything that comes to mind? Hardly. You know well enough from your own experience that there are some acts of so-called freedom that destroy freedom. Offer yourselves to sin, for instance, and it's your last free act. But offer yourselves to the ways of God, and the freedom never quits. All your lives you've let sin tell you what to do, but thank God you started listening to a new master, one whose commands set you free to live openly in his freedom. So Paul says that, but offer yourselves to the ways of God, and the freedom never quits. Give yourself up to God. Paul talks about leaving the life of sin, and he isn't just talking about little salacious acts, little erotic moments, little moments of being a misfit. He's talking about this whole bondage to being caught up in a world of distortion, an existential separation from God, something heavy and weighty, something more than just doing a few bad things in life. He's talking about really what I think our own psychologists of today have identified as the great human struggle with the ego. This whole construct of a self, this persona, if you will, of being who you are, I think that gives us a greater sense of the measure of the weight of the sin that Paul is talking about. He's really addressing, though, even the sin of the community and its isolation through legalism and its break-off from the God of Israel. And as what he is and was at that time, a pious Jew, he is trying to bring people back into their understanding of the God of Israel, but now a transformative God working through the sonship of Jesus to bring all human beings to a fullness. We in our modern time, again, in our psychology, understand that the burden of the ego, the selfishness that weighs us down, and the need to defend that ego constantly with perks and freedoms, if you will, is the addiction of the time. Clearly, the persona of our current historical moment is an odd form of narcissism, where we would actually stand in a crowd and say, selfish, proud of it. What in God's name has happened? When I go to a restroom, I wash my hands. I do that for someone else. I really don't do that for myself. And when I come out, I have benefited the community. Suddenly, this act of personal hygiene is perceived to be some sort of weight against my freedom. Somehow it's a burden for me to bear. I don't have a constitutional right to go up on a balcony in a theater and spit down on people. That is no measure of freedom. Wearing a mask is for someone else, not simply to protect yourself. And that wearing of a mask is a metaphor for me right now where we're called to be out and connected to other people. And in order to move out to be a whole person, we need to understand how it's leaving an old form of bondage, the bondage to ego, and being liberated. But the liberation is not a new opportunity for license and self-indulgence. Indeed, obedience. We need to understand that it isn't so much freedom and obedience, but it's more the idea of being able to move forward, to freely choose the obedience that is the work of God. We're invited, in other words, to be slaves for Christ. That isn't a really well-marketed phrase, is it? But Paul considers this a liberation. He considers this a new opportunity to break out of the old. And he says with hope that, thank God you've started listening to a new master, one whose commands set you free to live openly in his freedom. That's the invitation. And the bridge to do that is to leave this self-construct, this weight of the ego, which we are actually in bondage to. That is our slave quarters, if you will. To be liberated from that and to enter into a new love and possibilities through Christ is to follow him and to take on his being, his love. And so it has to do with our neighbors, doesn't it? It has to do with the people all around us. And it turns out that we go to meet the neighbor and serve that neighbor in compassion. We meet the Jesus in ourselves. We become the Jesus we already are in faith. And that mystery is opened up through compassion. In that act of self-giving, letting go of the wretched self in bondage and opening up to a new self obedient to the call of love, we can be in a full place that God invites. And in that invitation, guides us to a wholeness of purpose, which together in our community can be of great and momentous impact. Right now in history, we're being called to a new freedom through the relationship of love and kindness person to person. And with that freedom comes a new obligation, a new possibility of binding up the wounds, of helping the brokenhearted, of leading us all together through the shadows of the injustice we are facing to the higher ground, where God can allow love to manifest in us in a greater way. Holiness and spirituality is often packaged in that ego package, and therefore is confined by this sin that Paul refers to. It's not legalism, it's not religious teachings. Jesus, in his words in Matthew, lead us to understand that we're called to be something and do something powerful, yet remarkably simple. We are intimately linked in this harvest work. Anyone who accepts what you do accepts me, the one who sent you. Anyone who accepts what I do accepts my Father who sent me. Accepting a messenger of God as good as God's messenger. Accepting someone's help is as good as giving someone help. This is a large work I've called you into, but don't be overwhelmed by it. It's best to start small. Give a cool cup of water to someone who is thirsty, for instance. The smallest act of giving or receiving makes you a true apprentice. You won't lose out on a thing. So Jesus says again, the smallest act of giving and receiving makes you a true apprentice. You won't lose out on a thing. Indeed, I suggest you'll gain everything. This is the beauty of entering into that servitude of love and compassion. You give up, that's what's really messing you up, and you take on a whole new thing that can make you new again day by day. So the world needs you. It needs you liberated from your ego. It needs you to put down that selfishness which seems so tempting. It needs you to leave that empty space of thinking more about yourself than others. We all do this. We're all fed a self-centered view of the world to the point where we've lost even a sense of what freedom is supposed to mean. And I invite you to take on new purpose, new work, new aggravations, new accommodations for others, for the folks around you, for me indeed, because together we are in this struggle. Together we are all vulnerable, and together is where we find that love and grace known through Jesus Christ, and in his name, amen. Thank you for listening to this message. If you'd like to know more about the work of the First Congregational Church of Rowley, you can go online at firstchurchrowley.org. If you'd like to support the ministry, you can also make a donation online, or you can send a contribution to 175 Main Street, P.O. Box 364, Rowley, Massachusetts, 01969, or you could call us at 978-948-3993. So, best wishes. May God be with you in your journey of faith in these challenging times. This is Tom Bentley, pastor of the church, saying goodbye.